Okay, is it recording? I can't see because I taped over it.
Yes, it's recording.
I'm assuming it's recording. Okay, welcome to Bootleg Production. My name is Mr. Crawford. Move. All right, so I should do the whole cheesy like, hello, I didn't see you kind of thing. All right, so we're gonna try this, all my online peeps, and we're gonna try to learn and talk about histology, which is the study of tissues. And so, as I was telling all 5 of these people here, histology is kind of boring for some students, but histology is very important for anatomy and physiology. I feel like I need to look at the camera, but I know that I'm not supposed to. But histology is very important in anatomy and physiology, and we have to understand that it's something we just have to learn, okay? So, we talked about this in class, and it was in a PowerPoint that was sent out in Histology. But we talked about the 4 different types of tissues, and that was connective tissue, muscular tissue, epithelial tissue, and nervous tissue. And each one of these are made up of specialized cells that work together for some common purpose, that purpose being homeostasis in the body. Now we know that they're tissues because we see more than one cell, with the exception of like the neuron, it's got to be a show-off and just work by himself. All of these systems have at least one or more cell, or all of these tissues have at least one or more cell, which is what makes them a tissue. And so they get really convoluted and kind of hard to keep up with note-wise, so the notes for this are kind of hard to follow, so that's why I decided not to do notes for y'all. I feel like I can yell too, but I know it's picking me up, like that's the thing. Okay, so 4 types of tissues. So the first one we're going to look at in this class is something called epithelial tissue. And so epithelial tissue is what makes up everything and anything that has to do with a membrane or a tube or anything in between those two things, okay? So this is what we call like glandular tissue, epithelial tissue, all these types of tissues that have epithelial to go along with them have one thing in common, and that's that they're very good at absorption and secretion of products across a membrane. And so this is an example of just some like cuboidal epithelial tissue, but we find epithelial tissue like here, okay? It's our skin. It's what makes up any type of mucosal or mucus-producing membrane, and it's what we have to cover because of COVID-19, because again, these cells are really good at absorbing and secreting things in and outside of their cells. So we cover our primary receptors of epithelial tissue, which is the nose and the mouth, so that we don't inhale these types of things, like COVID-19 and other germs. That's why we tell you not to touch your eyes and your face, because your face is covered in epithelial tissue. It's your skin, okay? The inside of your mouth. All of the alimentary canals inside the body are lined with this epithelial tissue. And so you're not going to be able to see it on camera, but I'm pointing at a rectum. But I'm pointing at a picture of the digestive system. And so all the digestive system, I don't know if you can see it, Carla, but inside it looks kind of squishy, and it is. But it's made up of this, you can see it here, it's made up of this epithelial tissue. And it's what lines all the internal organs that we have, like the inside of them, any canal. So like when you swallow something, it goes down from the mouth into the esophagus, down to the stomach, and then through the digestive system. All of that is lined with epithelial tissue. Same thing with your lungs. When you breathe in air, okay, it goes into your mouth or into your nasal passages, into the trachea, and then into the lungs. The lungs are lined with epithelial tissue. Why? Because they're good at absorbing and secreting materials. What materials do the lungs absorb? Yes, oxygen. Very good. Okay, so they absorb oxygen. Do they only absorb oxygen? No, they absorb carbon dioxide too, because your lungs aren't perfect, but they make do with it nevertheless. Okay? And so some common things about epithelial tissue is we need to understand the general anatomy of an epithelial cell or epithelial group of tissues. Okay? And so the top of it is what we call the free surface. It's just the apical surface. You probably remember apical meristem from biology. It's just the top of something, or it's the root tip of something. If it's got a top, then chances are it's probably got a bottom, and that's what we call the basal surface. It's just the basal side, the underneath this side. Below that, there's a small subregion of specialized tissue and specialized cells that we call the basement membrane, and I forget what is below this. I think sometimes this is where we find melanocytes, or like melanin producing cells. I forget that happens. Okay, in all of these types of tissues, these epithelial tissues, what we call vascular or avascular, which means no blood vessels. So why is it when you get cut you bleed? Well, because those other tissues have blood vessels associated with them. Okay, but it's kind of weird when you think about it. Like, how come you say skin is an epithelial tissue, and when you cut your skin you bleed, but the skin has no blood vessels? That don't make sense. So what's going on there, do you think? Or rather, what does that tell you about the depth of skin? It's not very it's very thin. It's not very deep. Okay, so you cut your skin. It's like if you ever cut yourself with a knife. Like, I have a scar right here. You cut, and then you can kind of see like the little line where you cut yourself. It's like, oh, it's gonna hurt in about 3, 2, and then you just feel that from after you cut yourself. Okay, but it takes a little bit of time for it to bleed. That's because you do have some blood vessels beneath the surface of these epithelial, or beneath the basement of these epithelial tissues. You don't have them directly entwined with these tissues, okay, like you would for muscular tissue or nervous tissue, things like that.
It doesn't hurt if you cut yourself like right after, as soon as it has contact. Why is that?
So my best guess would be, for those of you at home, she asked, why doesn't it hurt right away whenever you cut yourself? I think it has to do with just the delay in sending a message from here to there, because your brain has to process that, and when that happens, like, all pain really is a bunch of sodium, like Na, the stuff that's in salt. It's a bunch of sodium particles flooding a certain channel. It's flooding a neuron. I don't have a picture of it, but it's flooding a neuron channel, and for whatever reason, we register that as pain. And so when you go to the dentist and they numb you up, what that numbing medication does is it blocks these sodium channels from absorbing the sodium again, so that it can't just keep shooting it back out into your system, okay? So why don't you feel it immediately? I think 1, there's just a little bit of a delay. 2, it could be that like there's not a ton of like nerves close to some areas, because you know you prick your finger, like when the way that they used to draw blood was they prick a finger, and that was really sensitive and it hurt, okay? But if you cut the top part of your hand, or if you cut the side or someplace like that, there might not be a nerve as close, so it might not be as painful. I don't know. That's a good question. But that's kind of like why when you touch something, like if they say that there's a fire or something, and you want to see if it's beyond that room, you never touch it directly with your hand, because well, A, it's just going to burn. You always want to touch it with the back of your hand. Okay? And it has to do with like either this is more sensitive or this is more sensitive. I forget. But it has to do with where the nerves are, essentially. Maybe just a train of thought, but that's okay. Okay, so that's epithelial tissues. That's like the common, like generic epithelial structure. We spend the first like week talking about specific epithelial tissues. So what we're going to look at real quick are just some of the common ones. So the first is what we call a squamous epithelial tissue, a cuboidal epithelium, and a columnar epithelium. And all these are what we call simple. Not because they're not smart or because they don't know how to do their job, but because they really are simple. It's just one layer, okay? Now, you take 2 layers of squamous tissue, you add it up, and all of a sudden, it becomes stratified. It becomes special. It becomes smart. And I'm going to cut back, like, cut it out, and I'm going to cut to me doing, and don't you ever! Alright, so you take more than one layer of like a squamous tissue or a cuboidal epithelium or a pseudostratified thing, and it becomes stratified. It goes from being simple and basic to complex and unique. So each one of these has a purpose, and we find these all over the body, and we'll talk more about them in detail later on, but this is just kind of the general idea. Scientists were very creative when they named them, because they're just named based off of their shape. Why do you think it's called cuboidal? Well, because it's little cubes. Exactly, they look like little icebreakers stacked on top of one another. They're called columnar because they look like columns that are stacked up on top of each other. You find this all over the body, especially like in the intestines. And pseudostratified, which is kind of like they got smushed. Okay, and And then we can find different types of this, okay? It goes even further, and this is why epithelial tissues are kind of a problem for students to learn, because you go from just epithelium and just epithelial tissues to specific glandular epithelium. And a gland is just something that produces a type of chemical or hormone in the body, such as the pituitary gland or the adrenal glands. So like when you get scared, like that, your body wakes up and it says, oh hey, something's going on, there's some stimulus I gotta respond to. So we're not gonna talk about glandular epithelium today. We will, and just discuss it about like what it is briefly. Basically, there's two types. There's an exocrine and an endocrine type of adrenal gland, or type of gland, okay? The difference is illustrated here on the slides. Basically, the exocrine secretes stuff out, it has like an opening or a pore that it goes through, and then the endocrine secretes it directly into the bloodstream, which is why adrenaline goes to work so very fast, because it's being produced in the adrenal gland, so just instantly in the body. It's in the bloodstream, it's good to go. But if you have a zit, okay, you have a clogged exocrine gland or a sebaceous gland, it takes a while before that zit becomes like a true zit. Okay, if it gets really big, you can go in on Dr. Pimple Popper, and she'll knock it off for you and save it in a jar. It's just weird, but it takes time. Like it's not as fast. Okay, and so we will go through all these in detail, but you can see how much of a struggle that they can be. Okay, next we have connective tissues, and connective tissues are again one of the four types that we have, and these are the different types of connective tissues in the body. So we have cartilage, we have bone, we have blood. And then we have something that's called connective tissue proper. And we'll talk about where these come from and how they're connective tissues and why each one is relevant. But the gist of it is that all of these types of tissues are doing one thing, or they have a unifying characteristic, which would be what?
Connective tissue.
They connect stuff, right. So they connect things. That's literally all that they do. So the tendons, the ligaments, blood vessels, bone, cartilage, all that is a connective tissue, okay? Or it's a type of connective tissue that either supports or connects body organs or body structures, together in the body. That's why it's called body structure. I know, I'm trying. I'm kind of nervous. I'm on camera. I've never done acting before.
We will talk all about how it has all these different types of things associated with it, and we'll talk about how each one of them develops. This is a fun one to talk about because it's a hard word to say for some students. Hematopoietic cells, blood. Loose and dense, gets very difficult to remember which is which, and we'll talk about that. We'll talk about this too. This is the bouncy stuff that makes your joints not hurt and that goes away when you get old. We'll talk about bone and blood and all these good types of connective tissues. And that's pretty much it for the introduction to like histology. There's another lecture that's going to go along with this, but when we talk about the other units, we talk about examples like skeletal muscular tissue and nervous tissue. Nervous tissue is pretty easy. It's just basically like pretty much just like a little cell that has like a bunch of little electrical impulses to it. It's kind of like a surge protector. It just has a bunch of outlets for data collection. And then skeletal or muscular tissue is also interesting and also easy to understand because it's easy to visualize those, and we'll talk about those later. So if you like that comment, make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and see my videos for new updates. Or
You're already posting them?
no, not yet, but I'm going to. See, now I got to record it. So, but no, that's what all the YouTubers do, right? So make sure you like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications if you want more of this content. Thank you for joining Mr. Crawford.